A man in designer suits and a $50,000 cashed-up man purse was found dead in his own garage just 2 days after his final arrest, and the storage auction world has never fully recovered from the loss. Storage wars turned ordinary bidders into household names, sending millions of viewers into a frenzy every time a padlock got cut and a mystery locker swung open. Since its debut on A&E in 2010, the show built an entire cultural moment around the idea that anyone with a sharp eye and a bit of nerve could stumble into life-changing money hidden inside somebody else's forgotten belongings. It spawned spin-offs, made minor celebrities out of everyday auction buyers, and kept millions of viewers tuning in season after season to watch strangers gamble on unopened storage units. The show promised easy fortunes and colorful characters fighting over other people's abandoned belongings, and for over a decade it delivered exactly that. But behind the auctioneer's chant and the theatrical bidding wars, several of the people who built this show with their personalities are no longer with us. Their stories didn't get the same airtime as their biggest wins, yet they deserve to be remembered honestly, in full, and with the same care the show never quite gave them. This is the real story of the Storage Wars cast members the show lost, and what their lives looked like once the cameras stopped rolling. Mark Bolello was impossible to miss the moment he walked onto an auction lot. He showed up in sharp, flashy suits, carrying tens of thousands of dollars in cash inside a leather bag he jokingly called his merce, and he bid like a man who never worried about losing. Fans and fellow buyers nicknamed him Rico Suave, a nod to his smooth, theatrical presentation style, and he became one of the more magnetic personalities during the show's second, third, and fourth seasons. Off camera, Bolello ran his own liquidation business, Bolello Incorporated, buying out storage units and reselling the contents through his retail operation. He had a genuine talent for spotting value, and he was even credited with helping return a rare, highly valuable comic book to actor Nicolas Cage after it turned up in one of his purchased lockers, a story that made headlines well beyond the reality television world. What most viewers never saw was the toll fame and addiction were quietly taking on him. Bolello had struggled with drug use for years, and he had already faced legal trouble tied to it before the show ever picked him up. In February 2013, he was arrested again, this time on charges of methamphetamine possession and being under the influence of controlled substance. He posted bail and was released within hours, but according to people close to him, the arrest left him shaken and deeply distressed. He reportedly told his fiancée he was struggling and afraid. 2 days later, he was found dead inside his car in the garage of his Simi Valley auction house. The engine had been left running, and the Ventura County Medical Examiner's office ruled the cause of death as asphyxiation from carbon monoxide poisoning, officially classifying it as a suicide. He was only 40 years old. His death sent a wave of shock through the Storage Wars community and beyond. Bolello Incorporated closed its doors for good, since there was no one positioned to step in and keep the business running. And the closure meant that everyday employees who had nothing to do with the show's fame lost their jobs almost overnight. For a man whose public image was built entirely on confidence, wealth, and swagger, the private reality was someone quietly fighting battles that never made onto the screen, a reminder that reality television rarely shows a whole picture. Looking back at his run on the show, longtime fans often point out that Bolello never seemed to fit the mold of the other buyers. He wasn't chasing the biggest profit margin so much as he was chasing performance and success itself. The idea that if he looked wealthy and acted confident, people would treat him that way. That approach made him magnetic television. But it also meant the cameras captured every embarrassing setback and public misstep right alongside his triumphs, at a moment in his life when he could least afford that kind of exposure. His arrest wasn't his first brush with the law connected to drugs, and the added scrutiny that came with being a recognizable face on a hit cable show only seemed to intensify the pressure he was already under. Friends and family who spoke publicly after his passing described a man capable of real generosity, someone who had been involved in charitable causes like autism awareness fundraising, even while privately unraveling. It's a contradiction that shows up again and again in stories like his. Someone capable of warmth and community involvement, while simultaneously losing a private battle that few people around him fully understood. Long before most fans ever heard the name Mo Pregoff, he had already built an entire life outside of television. Morris Pregoff, known to viewers simply as Mo, was a working podiatrist in the Dallas area for well over 4 decades, treating patients throughout Oak Cliff and North Dallas long before Storage Wars, Texas, ever aired. Auctioning storage units wasn't his career. It was his passion project, something he pursued alongside his medical practice because he genuinely loved the thrill of the find. For years, he had collected antiques and mid-century furniture as a hobby, eventually opening his own boutique called River Regency, where he sold the treasures he uncovered. When Storage Wars, Texas launched in 2011, Pregov joined as a series regular, earning the nickname the Doc for obvious reasons, and quickly became one of the spin-off's most beloved figures. His playful chemistry with fellow buyer Mary Padian gave the Texas version of the show some of its most memorable, light-hearted moments, and his tall frame, sharp wit, and larger-than-life personality made him stand out even among a cast full of big characters. After Storage Wars, Texas wrapped its run in 2014. Pregov quietly returned to the two things that had always mattered most to him, his medical practice and his antique business. He kept a relatively low profile in the years that followed, though he stayed close with Mary Padian and continued sharing glimpses of his life with fans who remembered him fondly. Those who knew him outside the show often describe a man of unusually wide-ranging interests. He loved to travel, taught when he had the chance, kept up an active life that included swimming and basketball, and never lost his enthusiasm for gardening or collecting fine art, hobbies that had nothing to do with either medicine or television, but that filled out a life that was clearly about far more than a nickname on a reality show. He was a proud member of the Texas Podiatric Medical Association throughout his career, and remained active in his practice, even as his fame from the show gave him a second, smaller spotlight he never seemed particularly eager to chase. What the public didn't know was that Pregov had been privately dealing with a serious illness for years. According to his obituary, he faced a 6-year battle with condition, supported throughout by his wife Michaela, whom he affectionately called his wife for life. Even as his health declined, he continued making occasional appearances during the show's third season, appearing in a handful of episodes before stepping back entirely. He passed away on March 4th, 2021, at the age of 78, leaving behind a legacy that stretched far beyond reality television, one built on decades of caring for patients and a genuine love for the hunt that had nothing to do with cameras or ratings. His obituary noted that his patients loved him for his generous, fun-loving spirit, a detail that echoed exactly the kind of larger-than-life warm fans had come to associate with him on screen. Few cast members brought as much warmth to Storage Wars as Gunnar Nezhoda did. Born in Austria and later based in Las Vegas, Gunnar lived a rich and unconventional life long before he ever appeared on the show. He had worked as a professional bass player, performing alongside respected musicians in the rock world, picked up acting credits in independent films, and built a career as a photographer whose work appeared in advertising for major companies. When his son Renee Nezhoda and daughter-in-law Casey joined Storage Wars as a father-son duo running Bargain Hunter thrift store in Poway, California, Gunnar began tagging along, learning the auction business from Renee starting around the show's 8th season. He wasn't chasing fame or trying to reinvent himself. He was simply enjoying time with his son, and that authenticity came through on screen. Fans adored him for his easygoing charm and comic timing, and by all accounts, he was just as well-liked behind the scenes, with cast and crew alike describing him as someone who never generated the drama or hostility that defined other parts of the show. In 2022, roughly 6 months before his death, Gunnar was diagnosed with lung cancer, a disease tied in part to decades of smoking. He and his family made the decision to keep the diagnosis private, hoping he would recover and not want his illness to become a public spectacle. He underwent treatment, including emergency lung surgery in Utah, but the disease had already caused extensive damage. Renee later explained that his father's lungs were riddled with holes and that doctors had exhausted their options. Gunnar Nezhoda passed away peacefully in his sleep on March 21st, 2023, at the age of 67, with his other son Ricky by his side. Renee shared the news directly with fans in an emotional video, thanking them for the years of support and describing his father as someone who never received hate from anyone connected to the show. It was a rare tribute in a franchise often defined by rivalry, a reminder of just how deeply Gunnar's kindness had resonated with the people around him. What stood out most in the tributes that followed wasn't just the sadness, but the consistency of how people described him. Cast, crew, and casual fans all seemed to land on the same words: kind, Easygoing, someone who made the people around him feel comfortable. In an industry built on manufactured tension and competitive editing, Gunnar had somehow carved out a place as the one person almost nobody had a bad word to say about. Renee's decision to keep his father's illness private for 6 months reflected the same instinct that seemed to define Gunnar's entire approach to fame, treating the show as a fun family project rather than the center of his identity, and protecting the people he loved from turning his final months into a spectacle. Of all the losses connected to Storage Wars, few hit as hard or as recently as the death of Daryl Sheets. Known to fans as a gambler for his willingness to take big risks on unopened lockers, Daryl was one of the original faces of the franchise, appearing in over 150 episodes from the show's very first season in 2010 to his final appearances years later. He built his reputation on instinct and nerve, often walking away with some of the show's biggest and most talked-about wins. And he frequently appeared alongside his son Brandon Sheets, who fans nicknamed Sidebet. Daryl's health had already tested him once before. In 2019, he was hospitalized after suffering a heart attack and battling congestive heart failure, a frightening stretch that required surgery and months of recovery. He pulled through, made lifestyle changes, and eventually opened his own store, Show Me Your Junk, in Lake Havasu City, Arizona, where he settled into a quieter chapter of life while still occasionally appearing on the show as a buyer. That quieter chapter came to a devastating end on April 22nd, 2026. Police in Lake Havasu City responded to a call at his residence at around 2 in the morning and found him dead from what officials described as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 67 years old. In the months that followed, investigators confirmed to the Mojave County Medical Examiner's office that his death had been ruled a suicide, and a police report later revealed that a note found hidden in a bathroom closet near where he was found referenced online harassment, with Daryl reportedly writing in shaky handwriting that he could no longer handle what he described as bullying on social media. According to that same report, he had told people around him in his final hours that he was receiving death threats, though he reportedly declined to elaborate further before his death. Investigators also looked into allegations of cyberbullying connected to his final months, submitting his phone for forensic analysis as part of the inquiry. While reports indicated he had been dealing with significant personal and family stress, along with ongoing insomnia, in the weeks before his death. According to accounts later provided to police, he had spent part of that final evening in his garage, upset after a tense exchange of messages involving his family. His son Brandon shared an emotional public tribute, writing that his heart was broken and promising to honor his father's legacy and continue building memories in his name, adding that he hoped to keep alive everything his father represented for both himself and his own son. Fellow cast member Renee Nazoda publicly urged authorities to investigate the harassment claims, a sign of how deeply Daryl's death affected the extended Storage Wars family, many of whom had known him for well over a decade of filming together. For longtime viewers, losing Daryl felt different, not because the story was more tragic than the others, but because he had been there from episode 1, a familiar face who had already survived one health scare and seemed, to the outside world, to be doing just fine, running his shop, spending time with his son and grandchild, and still occasionally showing up to be at the auctions that had made him famous in the first place. Taken together, these 4 stories paint a picture that rarely made it onto the actual episodes of Storage Wars. The show sold viewers on a fantasy of instant fortune, a locker full of forgotten treasure waiting behind every padlock. And for a while, the fantasy was entertaining enough to keep millions of people tuning in every week. But fantasy and reality rarely line up perfectly. Mark Bolello's confident, image-driven persona masked a private struggle with addiction that ultimately cost him his life. Mo Pregoff quietly carried the weight of a long illness while continuing to show up for his patients and his community for years without complaint. Gunnar Nazoda chose to keep his cancer diagnosis private rather than let it overshadow the joy he found in spending time with his son, right up until the very end. And Daryl Sheets, one of the most recognizable faces in the franchise's history, struggled with pressures that reportedly followed him well beyond the auction floor and into a far more merciless world of social media. What makes these stories worth telling isn't the tragedy itself, but the humanity behind it. Each of these men built lives that extended far beyond the show that made them famous. They were fathers, spouses, business owners, musicians, doctors, and friends long before any camera crew showed up, and their identities never fully collapsed into characters viewers saw on screen. Reality television, by its nature, tends to flatten people into their most entertaining traits: the loudest bidder, the biggest risk-taker, the smoothest talker. It rarely has room to show someone quietly battling illness in private, or wrestling with addiction behind a polished public image, or facing harassment long after the fame that invited it has faded. The cast of Storage Wars spent years competing against each other for boxes full of unknown objects, but off camera, some of them were fighting battles that had nothing to do with winning an auction. It's also worth remembering how differently each of these men chose to handle what they were going through. Bolello's struggle played out publicly, tangled up with legal trouble that made headlines even before his death. Prigoff and Azota both chose privacy, quietly managing serious illnesses while continuing to show up for the people who depended on them, letting almost no one outside their closest circle know how serious things had become. Sheets, according to what emerged since his death, was dealing with pressures that followed him well past retirement, in a digital world that didn't exist in the same way when Storage Wars first premiered back in 2010. Reality television has always sold viewers a simplified version of people's lives. Months of footage boiled down into 40-minute episodes built around conflict and big reveals. What gets left on the cutting room floor is everything that doesn't fit that formula. The quiet years, the private diagnoses, the slow accumulation of stress that never shows up on camera until it's too late to ignore. If there is a lesson in remembering Mark, Mo, Gunter, and Daryl, it's that the people entertainment brings into our homes are still just people, carrying real struggles a format was never built to capture. The show will keep airing reruns, new buyers will keep opening new lockers, and the auctioneer's chant will keep drawing curious viewers looking for the next big find. But for the families and friends who actually knew these men, no rerun can replace what was lost. Their contributions to the franchise, and to the people who love them, deserve to be remembered as more than just a highlight reel. If this look behind the scenes of Storage Wars meant something to you, consider sharing your own memories of these cast members in the comments, and stick around for more honest, in-depth looks at the real stories behind the reality television shows you grew up watching.